Dottora Sara Niner, UC Monash University, no itene moderadora, senhora Mica Barreto Soares. A favor. Itene doutora, tempo de entrega.
Obrigada, Barak. Normanas manek ba itahotu. Noing depois de hora almoço nene, karik han halo itamatan dukur karik. Espera katak 30 to 45 minutos ba oine ito to sei matamos di rona itanian apresentadora doutora Sara Niner nebe maka sei apresenta conaba direito, proteção no desafios vai itanian trabalhador migrante sira iha Austrália nebe maka organiza tuir ka iha hal parte be Palm ka Pacific Australia Labor Migration Scheme ninian. Onra bota teves bahau atu simu knara hanesan moderadora hodi dune hau mos bele hoita botsira hotu bela prenelitan saida maka itani apresentadora sei fahemaita ihane doutora Sara Niner ihane ni apresentação ni sei fokus ba pontos hat ni kuliah kona ba ida primeiro curso kuliah toca kona ba direito migrante sernia, não nos sei que maculia quando ba perspectiva uso gênero ninian, ele liu haré que no ba o insight nia maluk feto wansira, nebe ba serviço ia rai liur, ia seria direito, liu asa por exemplo hanesan hetan proteção será ia parte saúde ninian, né? Depois ia sei que maculia sei tocamos quando ba desafio ser nebe maka Itani maluk será enfrenta, nós o governo australiano e o governo Timor-Leste organiza muito com lorita trabalhadores será vai à Austrália e os clima que nesse hato recomendação haré husi parte Austrália ninian nia karak atu toka katak se governo Austrália karik bel halo dia kliutan husi condição agora nebe maka itani maluk trabalhadores será enfrenta iha Austrália neba. Maybe antes hahu hafo tempo ba doutora Sara Niner atu apresenta ninian tópico how sei le luklay ninian biografia badak ihane prepara ho inglês tiona então how mos lai tempo prato halo tradução how le dit ninian short bio ne bemak ne prepara ho inglês e espera katak maluk sira bela acompanha informação ne bemak how le sobre doutora Sara Niner ninian. So I will briefly read the short bio of Dr. Sara Niner. She's an academic teaching in the fields of cultural and political anthropology and gender and development studies. Her work is deeply rooted in a personal commitment to human rights and social justice. She has undertaken primary field research in Australia and Southeast Asia, particularly in the new nation of Timor-Leste. Her research focuses on gender and development justice. As a regional gender expert, Dr. Sara Niner has analyzed and reported on gender issues in Southeast Asia for local and international development, international development agencies such as UNDP, UN Women, Oxfam, and International Women's Development Agency. Prior to becoming a scholar, she spent a decade working in solidarity with East Timorese diaspora in Australia, advocating for human rights and self-determination, followed by many years working and researching in Timor-Leste after the nation became independent in post-1999, for which she was awarded a service certificate for volunteers to East Timor by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs. More recently, in Australia, Dr. Niner has carried out research with marginalized communities such as refugees and migrant workers. As a scholar, she has published numerous publications, including become editor and co-editor. For example, she has edited a book called Women and Politics of Gender in Post-Conflict Timor-Leste, which was published in 2018. She also wrote a book about on Timor-Leste, titled To Resist is to Win. It's an autobiography of our current Prime Minister, Shanana Gusmao, with selected letters and speeches. And also she she authored another book on Shanana about leaders of the struggle for independent Timor-Leste, which was translated in Portuguese in 2011 and also translated into Tetum in 2022 by our Shega. I think these are the short bio o biografia bada kusi Dr. Sarah Nian. Without further ado, talaga sa tiputan, ita say for a tempo ba Dr. Sarah Nian at to presenta niyan topic ko na ba rights, protection, and challenges of migrant workers under PAM scheme. Dr. Sarah Nian.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Should I stand up?
By all means, yes.
Yep. Okay.
You have 30 minutes to present, so I'll, yeah.
On. Is that okay? I'm going to talk too loud. I'd like to thank Don Bosco, especially Padre Díli, for inviting me to come to Timor-Leste. Haven't been here for a couple of years, so it's very nice to be back. And also for looking after me and hosting me. It's been wonderful. Thank you. I also like to thank my friend, Mika Barreto Suarez, for introducing me. But I'm going to give this paper about, I've called it Promise and Precarity, Timorese temporary migrant workers in Australia. And it's really about what the Australian government could be doing better to look after the migrant workers that we have in Australia. So I'll get started. I'll just time myself so I don't talk for too long. Because I knew I was going to be talking to a lot of students today, and I'm a lecturer at university, I thought I'd include some of the theory, because I can't resist really. But if we go to the next slide, I've got my good friend Dog down here who's going to turn the slides for me. So this is just a summary of what the paper that I'm going to give is about. So it discusses the experiences of Timorese temporary migrant workers in regional or rural Australia, and analyses the underlying causes of their precarity or their precariousness, their vulnerability that impact their health and well-being. The findings that I'm going to share with you today are a case study of Timorese workers in Australia based on field trips we did to the big country town they live in, interviews and discussions with the workers and stakeholders. It discusses health, well-being, accommodation, workplace conditions, and employer-employee relations, and how these are shaped by broader political and economic processes. Generating and sustaining a low-skill workforce in Australia has caused ethical problems and conflicts since European colonisation. And unlike Timor-Leste, we still have an unresolved colonial dispute in Australia, where the colonisers are still in charge and the Indigenous people are still fighting for their rights. This paper argues for better visa conditions for workers and communication, access to basic healthcare while labouring in Australia, and improved oversight of employers and workplaces. But I was going to set first a little bit of global context or global structural inequality. So what I teach my students back in Australia is world systems theory, which presents an economic model of the world based on a transnational division of labour, divided into core countries, the former colonial powers like Australia, often referred to as the global north, and the previously colonised semi-periphery and periphery countries. Core countries have higher skill, capital-intensive industries which pay higher wages and make high profits for corporations, their owners, managers and shareholders. based in the global north, while the rest of the world has low-skilled, low-paid, labour-intensive industries and extraction of raw materials, like the Timor oil. This constantly reinforces the economic and political domination of core countries. Katie Gardner says, and I've got the quote up here, centres in the first world require that the third world remain underdeveloped in order for prices of raw materials and labour to remain low. In world systems theory, migration is approached in terms of structures and systems rather than individuals and their decisions. And it's therefore understood in terms of the extraction or the taking of labour out of the global south and into the core of the global north. Other scholars call this global apartheid or regimes of citizenship. Others go as far to argue that rather than alleviating poverty, labour migration mainly serves to re-entrench global inequality. But that might be too cynical. Okay, next slide, please. The World Bank, I'm sort of putting the figures you saw this morning into a global context, and here's, I don't know if you can see these little maps of the world, but the World Bank estimated that in 2021, global remittances from migrant workers around the world was around $600 billion. And you can see these bubbles, these green dots, are the size of the countries and what sort of money they're getting back. India and China have huge remittances flowing their way. Philippines, which has huge remittances too, they've got about 1 million workers out around the world. Theirs are too small to even be on this map, even from 1 million workers working outside the country, some of whom are here in Díli, I think, Filipino migrant workers. Some countries, 1/3 of their GDP is from these remittances. International labour migration is of global importance to the capitalist economic system. Remittances that workers send back to their families are double the aid budget of the world and similarly target the poor. Migrants as a development resource are it's not just about the money, but about the knowledge networks and the skills and the human capital that's accrued through their labour and travel. Developed countries need to recognise and acknowledge their dependence on migrant labour within their economic systems. In some places, migrant labour is really the engine house of the economic systems of some of the countries in the global north. And they need to recognise their dependence on migrant workers and offer much fairer conditions than what's on offer in certain places around the world. Okay, thanks, Job. Institutional labour migration is increasing around the world, and it has been, for decades. And it's a response by countries in the global south, like Timor-Leste and other places, Indonesia, to structural economic inequalities, increasing dependency on the global north. This is a quote from a Philippines senator from 1992, so a long time ago. He says about the million Filipinos labouring out in the world, today the temporary labour export industry has become permanently temporary. Moreover, it has grown from being a stopgap measure for their economy to being a vital lifeline for the nation. The labour export industry is really the biggest economic story for the country, for the Philippines. The success of the labour export industry is the best proof that our industrial policies have been a miserable failure. So he's talking about the failure of the Philippines government to improve and stimulate their own economy so people can stay home and work in their own countries with their own families. But this also works the other way around. COVID proved how dependent the global north was on migrant labour when they couldn't keep coming. Yet the power is with the employers in the global north. Bauman asks, is globalisation, or this global economic system that we all live with, the new form of imperialism or colonialism? The contemporary transnationalisation of labour is not a natural phenomenon. Labour markets are constructed and maintained. Economic, social and political pressure of implementing export-oriented development paths can and does outweigh labour-sending states' ability to look after their nationals overseas. Segmented labour market theory explains how labour markets in advanced capitalist economies are segmented into a primary market for natives, for Australians in the case I'm going to talk about, who get higher wages, security, prospects for advancement, and a secondary market for migrant workers of low-skilled, low-paid, low-prestige jobs. The control of migration and the treatment of various categories of migrants have become the basis for a new type of transnational class structure. But let me talk about the Timorese migrant workers now that I spoke to in Australia. So I want to talk about one particular young man that I spoke to called Tone. He was a young migrant worker who came to Australia in 2022 as part of the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, or PALMS, to work for 4 years at a meatworks in rural Victoria. In an interview, he told me, the pressure of work was so hard and the supervisors pushed you to work so hard. You had to work until the point of having run out of energy and having no strength left. The speed of the line, so this is a meat processing plant and the meat's coming past and it's got to be dressed and packed. The speed of the line was so fast there were no speed limits. After over a year of this kind of work on the production line, Tone kept getting a bloody nose and one day wasn't feeling well enough to work. So someone from Human Resources dropped him off at the emergency department of the local rural hospital, where he had to pay $700 Australian upfront for some tests that couldn't tell him what was wrong with him. He couldn't afford to pay for any more tests that were needed to diagnose him further. Workers in Australia pay full tax, an estimated annual revenue to Australia of over $215 million, but are not eligible to use the public health system or our Medicare health insurance scheme that all Australians have access to. One of the mandatory visa conditions for most temporary migrant workers is that they must pay for private health insurance, but the system's unfamiliar to workers and medical costs must be paid for upfront and then reclaimed from the insurance company. Workers often lack the knowledge, confidence and language skills to negotiate this pretty complicated process, and in practice this puts medical services out of the reach of migrant workers who send every spare dollar home to their families where the need is often greater. Tone still wasn't feeling fit enough to work, so he was given the ultimatum by his boss to return home to Timor and resign, or to go back to work. These options were dictated by Tony's visa conditions, which tied him to one employer, something experts say creates overdependence and the conditions for exploitation. As Tony considered what to do, sorry, I've lost my place. What to do, the HR officer pressured him to leave his employer-supplied accommodation, saying, "You're not working now, so how will you pay for the accommodation?" Tony didn't mention to me taking any sick leave, and it doesn't appear to have been offered by the employer, although after working for over a year, he would have been entitled to up to 4 weeks paid leave. Eventually, Tony told the HR officer, "I'll go back to my country," and agreed to resign. After recuperating back home in Timor-Leste, he ended up feeling well enough to return to Australia. His visa was still valid, so he came back and looked for a new job to keep earning money to support his family. While working informally for another employee, had a worse relapse, this time ending up at another rural hospital and being diagnosed with cancer. Tony was picked up by a member of the Australian East Timorese community who sheltered him and made sure he received life-saving cancer treatment from a public hospital that prolonged his life. Staff at the Independent Human Rights Law Centre that I spoke to in Melbourne assisted Tony apply for a medical protection visa so he could stay and access Australian public health that he needed to survive. Even though the Human Rights Law Centre had co-designed these newly created protection visas for migrant workers, they still referred to them as inappropriate and ill-suited visa pathways. It was a lot of complicated work to get the visa for Tony. When his treatment started failing, Tony returned. Christine's close Australian friends alleged the employer treated their staff with racism, bullying and exploitation, among other allegations discussed in my paper. The employer denied the claims, highlighting the long waiting list of workers wanting to join the company as evidence that the scheme was working well. The sorts of labour practices Tony and Christine and others, and it's been documented in the Australian media, were subject to have been reported in workplaces for years, particularly in their workplace in this town, which I argue is notorious for worker ill-treatment, and which appears not to have been subject to enforcement of Australian government regulations. Informal or undocumented workers are among the most vulnerable people in Australia due to their fear of being caught. 1 in 6 migrants are paid less than the national minimum wage, and the exploitation also undercuts local conditions. In 2023, the federal government passed a law clarifying that Australia's Fair Work Act applies to all workers regardless of immigration status. Migrant workers who take action against their employer may be offered one of these special short-term protection visas while pursuing justice, but they're quite new reforms. Okay, let's keep moving through. So in November, thanks, Tom. In November 2024, the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, Professor Obo Kata from Japan, made a 16-day visit to Australia and consulted with over 450 stakeholders from government, civil society, unions, academia, business and migrant workers. In August 25, so just a couple of months ago, he submitted a report to the UN Human Rights Council saying he was seriously concerned by the treatment of temporary migrant workers in Australia and had found disturbing, sometimes very serious patterns of exploitative practices by employers, labour hire companies and migration agents. He recommended the government strengthen its Modern Slavery Act by introducing due diligence obligations on businesses to identify and address human rights risks in their supply chains. He also called on the Australian government to address the significant power imbalances between workers and employers in temporary migrant worker visa arrangements, including rules that prevent workers moving between employers and independently accessing permanent residency. Thanks. While the term guest workers, which is often what temporary migrant workers are called, suggests they are treated like guests, their pay, working and living conditions tend to be set at a very low standard for the country where they are working. Although wages are typically 3 to 5 times higher they can get in their own country, Australia has not historically run guest worker schemes the way Europe and the US does, but offered permanent migration. My parents were migrants to Australia under these schemes, but lots of Europeans came after the Second World War. There's always been, this is the first time Australia's run this PALM scheme, this temporary migrant workers. Visa conditions tying workers to one employer make the PALM's workers more vulnerable to exploitation, although there are also provisions that aim to prevent this. It makes the workers less likely to advocate to have issues addressed. Our Fair Work Ombudsman reported that migrant workers comprised 7% of the workforce yet 44% of new litigations. This is a structural outcome of the precarious position of migrant workers who are excluded from social services, like our hospital system, have limited resident rights and are over-reliant on their employer for accommodation for all sorts of provisions, social welfare provisions. Joshua Strutt, a lawyer and the chief executive of the Immigration Advice and Rights Centre in Sydney, told the media this year, there's this really huge power imbalance that exists through this system that needs to be fixed. PALMS visa holders are one of the most exploited temporary visa holders in Australia. And you can see, sorry, can we just go back to that map? I didn't read out those stats. I mean, hopefully you've looked at them. But so we've got 30,000 PALMS workers in Australia. The largest group's from Vanuatu, followed by the Timorese. So there's about 4,000 migrant workers in Australia. The Ambassador Inez Almeida in Sydney told me she's got to look after 4,000 workers, and there isn't enough staff in her office to do that. Over 50,000 workers pre-screened are just waiting for job offers in all these countries with the red dots here. Visa conditions tying workers to one employer make them vulnerable, as I said. Okay, thanks, Job. For the next one. Experts concur, just looking how much time I've got left. 10 minutes, thank you, Mana. This is from an article about our Pacific family. That's how the Australian government talks about the PALMS workers from all those countries on that map. And they say in their article, workers might have formed part of our Pacific family, but visa conditions imply the type of family who was only welcome to visit sometimes when it suited, only for clearly defined periods. With only limited places available, the power to dictate the terms remained with Australians and with the employers particularly, who the government really represents. They conclude that reform will require serious policy change that truly recognises guest workers as people rather than units of labour. And this sort of conclusion has been come to all around the world with these temporary migrant worker schemes. Experts concur that the PALMS policy of tying visas to one employer must change so that workers can leave workplaces that may be exploitative, unsuitable, or even dangerous without fear of reprisals. Seasonal workers are vulnerable to exploitation arising from their limited labour market mobility and their desire to return in following seasons. And friends have told me that they are too scared to complain. And there have been workers who have complained and not been invited back in the future. International experts consulted for our study, the one I'm going to talk about in a minute, agreed that tying migrants to a single employer was the key source of precarity and a barrier to workers lodging complaints. The European Union has been amending their own visa schemes to reduce the dependence of workers on employers by allowing them to change employers. So that's one of the main things we recommend in our report. Thanks, Job. The Global Slavery Index estimates 41,000 people in Australia and almost 50 million people globally currently live and work in situations of modern slavery. Australian businesses employ migrant labour primarily from the Asia-Pacific region, which has the highest rates of modern slavery in the world. There is now a greater number of low-wage migrant workers in Australia than ever before. In 2023, an independent review of Australia's Modern Slavery Act concluded that there was no hard evidence that the Act has caused any meaningful change for people living in those conditions, and recommended a substantial overhaul of the Act, including the introduction of penalties and mandatory due diligence obligations, the same way the UN Rapporteur on Human Slavery did. And there's some other other figures up there, but I'll keep going because I'm running out of time. So this is the study actually that's just been released today that I've been working on back in Australia with a whole team of academics. We did case studies around Australia. I did case studies in Victoria, in the state I live in, but we did them also in Western Australia and New South Wales. We analysed barriers particularly to accommodation. We focused on accommodation because that was identified as a real problem in regional Australia, in country Australia, to think about recommendations to address these challenges and creating safe and secure working conditions for seasonal workers. We were funded by this group here, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. We did 60 interviews with workers and stakeholders across the case study areas. Thanks, Job. This is the report that's go the next one. That's just been released today. Next one. Yeah, there it is. That's the cover of the report. I've put the link up there if anybody wants to look at it, and also the little site that does the summary for it. So these are the sort of people we spoke to build our case studies. We spoke to the workers. We spoke to their advocates in the community, often the Catholic Church when it comes to the Timorese, but also others who have become friends with them in the places they live. It was very hard to talk to the employers. They didn't want to talk to us. Labour agents, labour hire companies also didn't want to talk to us, but we spoke to local government and planning, and we spoke to international experts. Housing's been identified as a significant barrier for temporary migrant workers. They compete for housing, there we go, housing with long-term residents, and increased pressure, we've got a housing crisis in Australia. We've got a lot of homeless people who don't have anywhere to live, and the migrant workers are the last in, last to find any decent accommodation. This is where I did my case studies. Next one. In Castlemaine, where I live there, and then down in Warrnambool, right on the coast. And these are the sort of accommodation workers you're in. Here's the issues from all the interviews I did with Timorese workers. These are the issues that came up for them. The personal issues, which came up a lot, being really homesick for Timor-Leste, worrying about their children if they had them, but parents, younger siblings. The loss of community and solidarity, culture shock, huge culture shock for a lot of young Timorese there without families, huge language difficulties, and mental health issues and substance abuse, people turning to drinking. Health, as I talked about, Tony, unfamiliarity and lack of access to the health insurance systems, expensive, unhealthy food and little time or space for physical exercise and relaxation. People are just basically working all the time really hard, and there's not a lot of time left over for anything else apart from sleeping and resting. Lack of pastoral care. The Catholic Church was really the only one offering it to the Timorese in the place I visited. Lack of community integration with the Australian community, which also led to inequality and racism. Housing conditions were often poor quality, overcrowded, no privacy, a lot of people jammed into one room, often very cold or very hot, expensive. They were paying bills that were really expensive. Competition with locals for housing, which led to conflict sometimes. Employment and workplace conditions like the ones I talked about with Tony. Lack of knowledge about their rights, harshness of the work conditions, and lack of independent advice, arbitration or representation. And people were scared of complaining in case they would lose their job. Sorry, that was on the next one. Yep, and we'll go again. see if I can get through all the slides. This was another article by a fellow anthropologist friend of mine, Michael Rose, who also has written about Timorese migrant workers in Australia. He talked about them explaining that they gave meaning to their hard work in Australia by framing it as part of a continuing national struggle for economic justice. He found almost all workers agreed that work in Australia was hard, sometimes very hard, entailing long hours, exposure to heat and cold, absence from family, lots of discipline from the employers and accommodation suppliers. It was the sense that they endured all this in the service of something bigger that made it bearable. One of the Timorese he spoke to described it as, our fathers were part of the Frente Armada, we are of the Frente Economica. Assumptions that migrant workers are primarily there to make money is also, but it is also inspired by this spirit of collective sacrifice and struggle abroad. Timorese draw on their heritage of struggle to make their work abroad, not primarily as alienated labour in that big global capitalist system I was describing at the beginning, but also as a way of contributing a meaningful part to a national struggle they have been taught about since they were children. I think Michael got that really right when he described those things in his article. Okay, so here's the recommendations. I'm going to whiz through them really quickly because I have got 2 minutes to go. My friend Manamika has just told me. So I think one of the main things is to get access to the public health system in Australia. So if people get sick like Tony and Christine, they perhaps could have been diagnosed earlier and perhaps their lives would have been saved. I believe the Australian government is really failing to protect these workers and people have been calling for this, but they're not listening. The visa conditions need to change. I think if the workers are coming to Australia to help our industries and employment gaps, bolster our economy and pay taxes to the Australian government, then the least we could offer them is basic health care when they get sick. The second is to change the visa rules, and really the main thing is to stop the guest workers' excessive dependence on a single employer. If it's not going well, they should be able to go and look for another job. They don't understand the system. They need an improved complaint system, access to a cultural mediator, those sorts of things. The third main area is communication and coordination of regional workers. I think there needs to be forums for workers to be able to discuss, to give each other solidarity, and discuss job options, to share information about how they've solved problems. Regional boards in the states or in the areas migrant workers are living need to be introduced. They do this in New Zealand very well. And creating hubs for workers to go to. I think this is the last one. I've got them listed in a lot more detail in a paper that I'm writing, and there should be standards, and this is what our report was mainly about, standards for regional workers' accommodation. And the workers should be told what those standards are. There are quite reasonable standards, but they're not enforced by anybody. Workers don't know what they are. They need to be told, and they need to have somewhere to go and complain about it and someone to advocate for them if they are brave enough to do that. Also, we just need more accommodation, and the Australian government needs to assist in the building of new accommodation and create sort of commercial partnerships to do this. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mana Sarah, Dr. Sarah Niner, for your very informative and very constructive presentations. Maluxira, ita foi Rona, doutora Sarah Niner, na apresentação sobre a situação italiana trabalhadores migrantes em Austrália. Hou karak halo dit molok fo tempo baita bots nessa são perguntas. Sabe halo sumari pontos tolo ka hatri be mak hau rona usi na apresentação meia hora de larane nia hu ho sada usi perspectiva teoria liliu hare kona ba teoria sistema global nia ni hare lidian katak sada trabalhadores migrantes internacional nene los katak nia contribui duni bai iha sistema economia global, mas vemos nia cria inigualdade iha mundo iha sociedade mundialnya neve maka ninian benefício nene barak liu ba emasar neve maka sayhansan donu ba serviço dene. Então iha neva ni hare katak situação neve ma acontece tania maluk trabalhador será enfrenta renevane né la oeste Timor-Leste será maka enfrenta situação nebe maka Austrália mas vemos maluk será nebe maka mai husi parte Pacífica nia por exemplo em São Vanuatu ini entrevista maluk ide além dos Timor-Leste mos husi parte Vanuatu nia nebe maka enfrenta situação hanesan liliu ba tratamento nebe maka mai husi governo Austrália rasik no mos hoba sabe emane be maka naimba trabalha serviço nene rasik por exemplo ini fo buat tolo ini dia katak triple wing nene dia katak ihana ba acontecimento né dia katak Laos state hare kona ba o insa haruka osan no pos ita remis nebe sim mas vemos iha consequência ne bolo katak social cost ka custo social nebe maka ita maluk trabalhadores será enfrenta durante cernia tempo iha Austrália ni hare katak problema comum nebe mak será enfrenta né hareba por exemplo nessa parte área saúde nia tratamento se migração em termos de direito visto bastante trabalhadores sernian hela ba e depois mos sernian condição saúde sernian hela fating né problema nebe mak precisa atenção e nia for recomendação a tu sugere ba governo Austrália a tu muda ka auto halu dia kliutang hodino ne bele fo proteção dia kliutang ba trabalhadores sira ne bema serviço ba Timor-Leste no mos ba maluk ser ne bema ia mais Pacific li husi programa PALM ka Pacific Australia Labour Scheme honin pontos importantes ne bema ka bele samariza husi apresentação mana doutora Sara Nainer nia desculpa bolo mana tambah conhecimento clear tem desde tempo resistência que das então hot tipo bolo mana doutora Sara Nainer então idane makanian sumari husi apresentação husi doutora Sara Nainer nian agora hau fo oportunidade ba mahusuk na intolo primeiro atu husu pergunta depois meta se loketan sessão ba tolo icos tolo segundo depois de na intolo husu loklai desculpa reitor hinta bot husu tiona mas hawarela fola kakara fola estudante ser lai kon lai haba mak senhor reitor pel husu parte ne iha pergunta Roma além estudante sira compreende saída mo doutora Nainer Sara Nainer apresenta né ok ena aware nain tolu kedas parte soring na mai molokau fo sedap depois então ha foluk tempo baida né maluk ha foluk madre lai madre favor né depois maka colega de kotup ba horde terceiro se soring karu kolos lai karik ita for ba parte clara yang tambah nain tolu foto lima be oportunidade vai ser atufuso sim madre.
Thank you for a very comprehensive and clear presentation. I have two simple questions. You have mentioned about the security of the workers in Australia. So I have thought of the Segurança Social, the social security system in East Timor. Here, 4% of the salary of the employee is deducted, and 6% from the employers are also deducted and paid to the social security system. so that in time of needs, like maternity leave, paternity leave, or death, they have something to get from that fund. So I wonder if in Australia, for those seasonal workers, do they have also social security as that? That's the first question. The second one is, in the presentation, I understood that most of the seasonal workers are involved in agriculture. And in my observation here in East Timor, we have also lots of graduates, professional graduates on education, like preschool and elementary education. I wonder if that could be an opportunity for them also to be working in the field of education, because as far as I know, there are also lots of day school and preschool in Australia, where I think our young graduates on education and basic education can be involved or can have this opportunity to get this job, the kind of job, far away, aside from agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you, sister. Colega Couto, depois maka itanya senhor reitor.
Thank you. I think it's a great presentation from Mana Sarah Nainer. So my question is very simple. So you also found out the challenge that Timorese workers face in Australia. I'm wondering whether the female and the male worker they face a different challenge. For instance, like accessing to the migration service, health service, like others related to their needs. Thank you.
Yeah.
Magnifico reitor suentea, tambah manang sirsilip lai, apa perdana baita bot.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Sarah Nainer. I just want to ask whether Timorese employee, the seasonal workers, do they entitled to superannuation fund or no? I mean, their salary normally, because I used to, while doing PhD in Australia, I also do some work with my supervisor doing research, and some of the pay were actually cut for the tax as well as for the superannuation. And at present, I still have 12,000 stay in Australia, ATU, which I will claim it when I get to 60 years, but I'm not sure whether Timorese workers also entitled to superannuation fund.
Mm.
And the other point is about the housing. That is very, very important, because in advanced society, they don't recognize you. You don't even meet the owner of the house. You just through telephone, and if you don't pay, they will kick you out.
Mm.
So I just wanted whether the government has a policy with the employers just to ensure that the workers, they have decent accommodation for them to live.
Mm.
All right, thank you. That's all the questions.
Thank you. Will I answer those ones now?
Yes.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Thanks for all those questions and the lovely comments. I might answer that social welfare system question and the superannuation question together. So the workers pay tax. Australian tax is quite high, and that should, and when I pay tax, that covers my access to the healthcare system. It covers all sorts of social welfare services, maternity services, all sorts of things. It covers my child's free education in good government schools. But the workers aren't entitled to some of those benefits that regular Australian citizens get. So they're paying the tax, but they're not getting the benefits. They also put money into a superannuation account that, as the rector mentioned, you should have access to when you're 60, but they just put it up to 65 and now to 67. But as a migrant worker, you can apply to have it back once you return to your country. But I have read a paper on this, and the process is so complicated, most migrant workers give up. Unless they work it out before they leave Australia, trying to do or fill out all these complicated online forms and processes from their home country has proven so difficult, people give up. And there's these piles of money sitting around in these superannuation funds that are not being accessed. And in fact, in my hometown, where I live, a country town, we've got 200 Solomon Islanders working at the local factory, and I organised a session for them on workers' rights and housing rights, but they wanted a session on tax and superannuation next, because they want to understand where their money's going and how they can get it back. They know it's there, and I think, yes, they should have access to the social welfare systems in Australia if they're paying tax like other citizens are. The question was about graduates doing more than horticulture. So I think about 70% of Timorese workers are in horticulture. The people that I spoke to work in meat works. So the abattoir down in the country town is 400 Timorese working there. There's over 1,500 staff in this place. It's enormous. They process so many animals every day on these production lines. And they've got workers there from China, from Indonesia, from Timor, from all over the place. And that's about another 20 or 30% of the workers work in those sorts of places. And then there's just these new industries around care where people are starting to get jobs now. So working in aged care, because in Australia most elderly people end up in aged care homes where they're looked after by nurses, often from the Philippines, but often care workers who are migrant workers to, or new migrants to Australia, or international students, or people, they're studying their nursing degree and they've got a part-time job in the aged care. Childcare is another area. I know you've got to have a childcare degree from Australia to get work in those places. So you would have to be studying an Australian degree program to get work in those places. But I also think if the migrant workers are paying tax, they should have access to our education system where you can get these certificates that allows you to work in childcare or in aged care. That's the gender analysis, yes. I'm so glad you brought it up. It's something I've written about. I think only about 20% of Timorese migrant workers are women, and it is a question of mine. I wanted to ask this morning, do people think that that's unfair, that women are only 20% of migrant workers and that 80% are men? Should women be given greater opportunities to become migrant workers? And they do suffer from different problems to men. As you know, in everything about life, women have a different experience of life than men and face different challenges. And one of them is sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. And I know of one case in South Australia where I think 16 Vanuatu migrant worker women, with the help of the local union, are taking a class action against the employer and taking them to the highest court in Australia for quite $1 million case for sexual harassment that had gone on for years and years, and the employer knew about and hadn't done anything about it, and these women had to put up with it. But it's another issue that the complaint system is so poor and understaffed in the Australian Department of Employment and Workplace Relations that people haven't really got anywhere to complain to about these things. So I think, women do need greater protection than men against these sorts of issues. They also need access to reproductive health care while they're in Australia. People have a right to reproduce if they want to, and they should get the care. There has been some real difficulties with migrant workers getting pregnant and getting sent home and shamed. I mean, they should be able to stay and have a baby if they want to. That's women's right to do that. I think there are really complex, difficult issues for women, migrant workers, that men don't face. And I think it's one of the reasons families won't let young women go and become migrant workers in Australia, and that's another big issue for Timor. Is that fair also, that families aren't letting young women apply for these opportunities because they're worried about what will happen when they go away? It's a big question for Timor-Leste. Yep.
Okay, ita liutiona saya primeiro sessão se menentolo autos pergunta. Haulo que sessão segundo vai menentolo tan. Ida hosine, hawakara ida hosine o parte nenya. Colega sira, alin sira iya. Hai, dukurga nusa. Ka pergunta malaya done. Doutora Sara Nainer é uma acadêmica, então eu gosto de uma desafios de ninguém faz ser ou encarar colega ser a experiência baraclica ou diferente ou diferença o doutora Sara Nainer encarar bela apresenta né. Você parte sorry já vai ida. Ok, então parte sobre mais Hanoi leva a follow oportunidade para parte Hanoi sorry losnian favor hato naran e direita ba pergunta. Hoje tenian MC hata kata kita bela ihatan 10 a 15 minutos então tempo luan tang perceber lo que tan sessão terceiro ba pergunta ou resposta. Favor.
Thanks for the chance, Dr. Nainer. Awesome presentation. My name is Felicito Mayo. I have one question for you. How effective have current monitoring mechanisms been in upholding migrant rights, and what role could civil society play in advocating for stronger enforcement against exploitation like wage delays? Thank you.
Do you understand the question, man? Yeah.
So in Australia, civil society in Australia or civil society in Timor-Leste?
Sociedade civil de Timor-Leste cá é a Austrália.
In Australia.
In Australia. Colega Sirato, dia kata pergunta bela husu a língua tetung ga inglês, ka bahasa Indonesia, ka português. Português mas haula bela traduz, tanpa haula não haten, mas bela hauna ihane itaya barak makulia português bela ajuda, nebe. Pergunta bela halo ia qualquer liang nebe ma colega se compreende, né? Urune bela loketan oportunidade ba alisrat husu. How for oportunidade ba parte clara.
Thank you, Sarah. Well presented. You mentioned one place in Victoria, which is Warrnambool. I've been there. I visited a lot of young Timorese workers, and I've been to Warabi and also Sale. Maybe you know that place. And the key issue that you pointed out, for example, the privacy. They live in cabin, and then I saw 4 or 5 people live together. There is no privacy, as you mentioned, and it's really happened. And the other thing is the healthcare issue. Are they allowed to have their own GP, general practitioner? And I like your recommendation, but is there any green light, or how long it's gonna take to solve this issue? Otherwise, I would say this is a soft exploitation. Thank you.
Ok, Iradan? Obrigada. Iradan? Então, falei tempo para ter a doutora Sara Naina a resposta, depois se loquetam para a colega Celeste. Oh, yeah, por favor. Okay. We have one more to go.
Thank you for the opportunity. So I have one question for you, Mr. Sar. This question is, as you presented before in the screen, that it was about 20,000 people that were working unlawfully in Australia. So my question is, how the government of Australia would give the sanction or grant some punishment or anything to these people who work unlawfully in Australia? So Father Zil have mentioned that before, but I just want to hear plainly from you. Thank you.
Was it to give us
At fazilo para trabalhadores, será?
People who work unlawfully in Australia, what are sanctions from the government to these people if they already discovered that these people working unlawfully in Australia? So that's my question.
There are a lot of. I have to acknowledge the work that the Australian Timorese community do in looking after the migrant workers. When Tony was sick, he was taken into a Timorese family house. He was cared for. He was taken for legal advice. He was taken to our local big cancer hospital in Melbourne. He really was cared for as his family would have cared for him, and advocated for. It was amazing to see the assistance that he got from the family that looked after him. So the Australian Timorese community do a lot to connect with migrant workers, to help them organise events. I went to a really fantastic November 28 event down in Warrnambool that all the workers came to, and the local Australian Timorese community helped organise. So there's their own community work for Timorese in Australia. The local retired priest in Warrnambool was about one of the only real help and support to the community there, and they really loved him for it. Father Laurie, so shout out to Father Laurie, called Catholics Against Human Slavery. But workers are warned by very scared too. Some do. Some Timorese have been very brave and joined the union. But what the unions have done, I think, is created the Migrant Workers Centre in Melbourne, who I've done some work with, who I think are just fantastic. So they're the ones that came down to Warrnambool and did the workers' rights session with the Timorese community, the migrant workers down there, so that people understood what their workers' rights are, because they don't know. They were getting ripped off for sick leave, for pay, huge amount of wage theft going on. So they really need, and what's been suggested is perhaps some links between unions here and unions in Australia and the migrant workers, giving them a bit more support. But the Migrant Workers Centre, and there's something similar in most states that helps migrant workers in each state. But again, there's small in number, hard to find. I asked them to come up and speak to the Solomon Islanders in my town, and also do a session on accommodation rights, housing rights, what you can expect, what sort of housing, you can complain about. So there is civil society support, but it actually needs to be more. I think there needs to be more social integration into the Australian society and community for migrant workers. And I think then you know, there would be many more people in Australian society willing to speak up for workers and help them get the help they need when they need it. So there's some there, but it needs to be more. Privacy came up in nearly every single interview we did, even if workers had finally, because the workers I was talking to are in Australia for 4 years, they have a job for 4 to 5 years. So living in crowded rooms with 3 or 4 others, sometimes more, was just unbearable to do it in a long-term way. Privacy just came up over and over again as possibly the biggest issue. Privacy and cost. When you're paying a lot of money for not very good accommodation, you get pretty cranky about it. Access to a GP is hard for everyone, even a lot of Australians. There's only certain GPs that you can go to and see for free without paying up front and then claiming back off our national scheme, and that's hard for poor Australians as well. Often in rural areas there's not enough GPs, so there's long waiting lists, and sometimes clinics won't accept new patients, so it's really quite hard. People end up in the emergency departments of hospitals because of lack of access to GPs. How to solve these issues? Look, all the suggestions are there. I'm one of, you know, a lot of people who've done research in this area, given recommendations to government. There's also, you know, the unions, the churches, the advocacy groups. It's about political will. And in lots of ways, migrant workers don't vote for our politicians and our government. It's not their constituency. You know, it's actually everyday Australians that have got to stand up and push for change and make our politicians do something. We have got the UN Rapporteur on Human Slavery coming in and telling the government that they're not doing a good enough job. That doesn't even seem to put pressure on them to change. So it's got to be citizens' movements, really. And the illegal workers, it's a huge issue in Australia, illegal workers, and they're not people that sneak in. Like I've heard someone say here, the jalan tikus. It's not people sneaking into Australia. It's people that come on a legal visa and then overstay. They don't ever go home. And I think there's, I can't remember how many they call them disengaged workers. So they've disengaged from the scheme, from the PALM scheme, and they're just off in Australia finding work, highly exploitable, paid low wages, and just trying to make enough money to get by usually. And they're hard to find, they're hard to access, they're hard to help. There's not a lot of assistance for those workers, I have to say. When they do get caught, they get sent home, but it's not just temporary migrant workers, it's working holiday makers, it's people visiting and overstaying. I don't know that there's a lot of assistance for those people. I think it's kind of a very grey area and very swept under the carpet, we might say in English. Kind of a hidden problem, really. Yep.
So ihatan ita iha, pelo menos idatang ita iha 5 minutos. Ita iha parte clarang, então fora da oportunidade vai amo vamos pergunta. We have one more question from the front. Por favor. Ita.
Tá bem, obrigado. Ao atraso itu ane behaladung assisti dia com essa matéria ne apresentou-se doutora Sara. Bahau ia questão roha tu levanta o momento dene. Primeiro, quando a política governo australiano nia atu valoriza mão de obra para trabalhadores sírios. Será que mão de obra né uniforma para migrantes sírios no cidadão sírio Austrália ou diferente? Segundo, quando cruza argumento si autor, orador primeiro, a doutora Sara ni Hanoi Ruma, atau for parecer Ruma. Parecer bela de forma tese ou antitese ou sintese Ruma. Quando fator idene be for causa ba migração maga o hin autor primeiro dihan fator ecológico ou climático. Minha argumento sustentável ou tohenbe ou bele prova tohenbe de bele futi argumento kata minha sai no fator ida nebe for causa e matu halo mundo sifat yang ida ba fatin selo ou sina saung ida bana saung selo. Obrigado.
Amo ausu desculpa, ida parte segura halo dum compreender. Sango bela kuliah inglês, bela diretamente em inglês, det cara kan honai. Ausu desculpa.
Usi orador primeiro, kuliah kata faktor ini be sai causa ba mahalo migração, maka faktor climática. Terus ia konteks idane, how to rona Dr. Sara ni Hanoi, ou ni Hanoi bele a favor ba argumento se auto orador primeiro, ou bele halo antitese ou sintese de Roma o se argumento ne.
Obrigado. I'll tenta traduzir.
I think there was different treatment of migrant workers and Australian workers, and that's why the government made a policy that all migrant workers came under our Fair Work Act. So there's a part of our constitution is a Fair Work Act, so that workers have to be treated, you know, they have to have safe workplaces. There's minimum wages set, just like here in Timor. And I think the case was migrant workers were being paid less, so the government had to make a new law and policy that migrant workers had to be treated equally under the Fair Work Act. So theoretically, migrant workers should be paid the same, have the same conditions, and I think in a lot of cases that's the case. But in cases like the one I was talking about at the abattoir in Warrnambool, it's not the case. And people weren't having the right leave conditions, weren't getting sometimes paid the right amounts and things like that. And the thing is that an Australian worker would go to the union and complain, and the union would go in and stick up for the worker and make them get paid the right amount. But migrant workers are too scared to complain in case their job gets cut, and they don't have an advocate often for them. Yeah. And as far as climate change goes, I mean, people are moving in Australia because of bushfires and floods, for sure. Absolutely, there's certain areas and, you know, parts of the world now, like Bangladesh, where people just can't live because of the crisis and disaster that's being caused by climate change. So people are moving because of climate change, for sure. I totally agree with that. Well, I think it's what I tried to say at the beginning was set up that the sense of global inequality and global economic inequality, and that it resting on this system of sort of neo-colonialism, we might call it, where the rich north that grew rich off colonialism is still the wealthy countries of the world, and the post-colonial countries are struggling. And so now the rich north gets to extract the cheap labour from the poor south, and still keeps making the money. The corporations and, you know, the agri-industry in Australia is making a lot of money out of cheap migrant labour. And the abattoirs. The family that owns the abattoir in Warrnambool is an incredibly wealthy family, and they're just making millions of dollars every year from cheap migrant labour working in their abattoir. So it reinforces. I think migrant labour is much more the result of global inequality, resulting from a globally unequal world than any other reason.
Espera kata kamu Simus saya dah makohing Dr. Saranana explicar, né? Okay. He accept and agree with you. Então, sei lá, oh, Laos, desculpa, Dr. Luís, desculpa, não é amo. Harus desculpa amo sira, mas não respeita na Fátima Dr. Luís. Não entre tempo lá ihona, rematona. Dalatan ita agradece tebes ba doutora Sarah Nainer nini apresentação hoje, informação rica tebes ba ita det. Infelizmente ita nia membro governo sira lá e a lormana sira lá como tuna. Informação será hoje na ONU pertinente de TVs, lá os sites han sabe exercício acadêmico entre acadêmico será det, mas vemos tu los né vai para político será vemos halo política ba itania malu trabalhadores será né hoje compreender dia cliutan ba assunto da né não nemos ba além estudantes será informação será o interessante agora na bela science tópico será ba colega será para bela hacker minha tese e halo pesquisa cliente liutan ba assunto né hoje né tabela halo produção conhecimento entre Timor-Leste será bela hatene dia cliutan taba ita iha sentimento conhecimento claro de knowledge det vemos ita como hatene dia que tem rai ita bela produz dia cliutan compara homos o colega sosial tahunnya sesama knedet dalatan obrigada barak Dr. Saranaida, thank you very much for your session. We hope that more opportunity will come and then you will come and present again. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our moderator and also Dr. Sarah Naina. I would like to invite the two of you to come to the front of the stage for appreciation. Turma, se formos apreciação, a minha moderadora, a nossa doutora Sarah Naina, vai apresentar a ONA, por favor. A fonte ita apresenta tia ita ninha civil apreciação vai ita ninha oradora na nossa moderadora ita se pausa la live pausa tu irmã vai intervalo café ninha 10 minutos ita se vamos apresentação música ou se ita nem contestante se o se mehi voice competition em Dom Bosco e se na hira se apresenta a música então molo kirane convida que a doutora Sara na nossa doutora Mika bela mais clara. A respeito, convido o reverendo padre provincial, na Manacleto, também entrega ela tais vai ter oradora, na nosso certificado de apreciação vai ser neiro amos. Itane Vasalima. As a symbol of appreciation, this is a certificate of appreciation from the organizing committee from the Superior Institute of Don Bosco and the National University of Timor-Leste. Nós ba doutora Mika, Itane Basaliman. Obrigado para o provincial, doutora Mika e doutora Sara. Thank you. Okay? And dali datang, okay. Obrigado, Bak. Thank you, provincial. Ba doutora Nairua. Anisanda fatin de dersang, ba aling estudante siri, ita hina fatin salão larandet, ita ninia snack se distribui ba ita vot sira. Nova senhora sira madre padre sira, al favor, ita bele pausa ba 10 minutos, ita continua fali, iha, tukuhat li minuto lima, ok? 5:04. Obrigado e até logo.
Micaela Hororon Neliang Moslos. Diak, lorai kita ne, ya sesama ne, atu apresenta itania seasonal worker sira, nomo seasonal trabalhador sira iha Korea, sira ini historia. So yane how la kuliah, la sai orador, mabe atu for introduce sounded, kata iha entrevista barakuan rumah nebe halo sira balung i atau sira kuliah konaba serne experiência iha Korea no iha Australia. Desafio rumah nebe sira hasoro neba no serviço neba ninia benefício rumah nebe karek sira experiência então ita barona hamutuk. Neduni la hetam petselu kita nendet makar katoto iha fo tempo ba tekniku sira atau tokatok video dan itare.
Ya, caminhada completo, seja tem Jesus Vidigal, ao município de Quissá, no há mais serviço e a Coreia 2019 e há mais serviço e a área de Ungido e a Potso.
Saída mak ita bot ni expectativa molo mai serviço e harai Coreia.
E a expectativa nebe maka hau anoin que nascia depois da mata secundária a mirona informação kata aqui Centro formação e becora no que curso balian Coreia para depois vai serviço na Coreia. Então foi daí hau rola iniciativa atau curso tu informação curso lia Coreia e becora depois foi mais serviço e a Coreia e não é bele muda nanti kita TIMORESE e vai ter futuro. Depois ia vamos ia desafio lugu kita. Primeiro memang kita soro curso nene tamalian memang kelahanesan ho itanya. Por exemplo, asa português ho itu nene ita bele ia alfabeto memang kanesa. Mas ia Korea nian alfabeto memang ka diferença tertemes. Então ida nem maksai desafio. Mas buat tidak la sai barreira para tu satang a minha vontade para tu estudar. Então desafio serne koko a minha vontade para tu estudar, no ikus mais a consegue mais a Coreia para depois halau de serviço. Depois estou a Coreia la os det maka buat serne. E hamos desafio lu gina be makita soro tambah itamai ho ambiente me maklahanesa, ho kultura me maklahanesa. E depois itamai hasoro mos ho ema hona saung oyoin maktama ya Korea. Então ainda temos desafio. Tambah itanya komunikação le diferença. Hulian de maklahanesa. Mas ane saung yang otete kata buat serne la sai sasuka baita para itanya itahamata itanya vontade. Ita nafati ya vontade, ita nafati ya espírito atau aprende, une ita boleh continua serviço ini. Namos ia serviço nemos ia problema lumung ita hasoro. Ita serviço ita mai fofo nene cada vez ita serviço la atene ema hakilar ita ema kuliah ita ini pun sai problema mai. Então buat serne hotu hanesang khawatir kata ita nafati ia vontade aprende ita quando vontade ita sindi kata serviço ita serviço ne ita sainai. Então ita sainai ma serviço ne ita hateno. Então buat serne hotu maka halo ita hasoro desafio serne koko ita nia vontade ita nia espírito o di luta nafati ngodi ita bele realize tene mehi sira. Tuir ita ne mehi sira expectativa memang kita hakar mai a Korea per mai atau muda tene polisi futuro. E nemos ita mai au mai serviço nemos laos dia kata mai per depois buka bahaunya ande atau serviço para bele hadiah ita ne TIMORESE vai ter família, haru como sali sira vai escola. Depois criamos condições vai ter futuro. Tambah futuro memang kita precisa tu hadiah maka harus agora, maka kita bele hadiah.
Olá, Raunenarang completo, Dina Mariana da Cunha Cáceres, Hausi município Manatuto. Agora dadang hau serviço Coreia completa financia atau batinan sanuno.
Pois durante tinan atau batinan sanuno na serviço ya rai dane, tabot halona buat rumah ba família.
Hau agradece teus ba maroma, hau la halo buat barake família, maybe natong ana mai hau bodi necessidade uma larang menina. E hamos Haumos pernah ajuda ansabak maluk sih kan bema hetan desastre, maski labaran me benaton, dan ibu sih hame forsa me bema durante ini hau hetan ia Korea.
Amara completo Napoleão Cardoso, hau si município Colima, Amai Korea ia 2021.
Mais ou menos itabot de maneira o insama pele ultrapassa problemas ser de itabot hasoro durante serviço de Coreia.
Em primeiro, a relação à pergunta de Ia, em primeiro, eu agradeço ao governo coreano, ele ofereceu a oportunidade de fazer Coreia tem um serviço de Coreia. Adia, relação à pergunta de Ia, Moris, ia menerai dokusi família, vai adaptar ao emana nação, ele nós buat lebih fácil. Musuh desafios hoje, pronto si família, pronto si serviço, e ambiente, desafios hoje. Mas livre si desafios, hirapne itala bele hakidu pada desafios. Manter na fati, udah aprende. Ucai itu tuhan mudança pada desafios. Nomos ucai itu hatomalan ho desafios. Itala bele halai sudah ada. Tambah a força ana fati, por exemplo, anesan desafios de asoro ia itala serviço fati. Por exemplo, mai ita mai fofo ita dificuldade teve só língua. Oisa ita hatomanan ho adapta ho situação dane. Pronto. Ita aprende na fati emelia. Oisa ne dificuldade serene ita mudança. Mas lá significa hal mudança 100%, mas passo por passo.
Mais ou menos itabot halau na buat rumah ba família wa hira serviço Coreia.
Sim, agradecer em ba hau ajudou na ali beleza bele ultrapassar ne estudo resta na yatinang kotu nível graduado na mos ajudou as família.
Ok, que obrigado a tempo. Hau naran completo Mário Jesus, hau si município rural. Hau mais serviço de Coreia durante tinang advancia e a Coreia.
Mais ou menos durante serviço e a Coreia ne problema saída de uma kita bota soro desafio saída.
Ok, e durante serviço e a Coreia desafios mesmo que desafios barbaros mas bem nunca fakir ba desafios serene. Tamo husi desafios serene mas motiva ita hanor ita atau bele ajuda no fofila ba alin sira na bema bele husi be futuro mane atau bele hatuir buat na bema kita soro ya Coreia. Mesmo que a soro yani a soro barbara ita mais diferente língua, cultura, pode ser lá nessa maybe na fati oferece na serviço aturo na fati buat be mesmo que lá dia maybe na fati hatam da sira kata buat be dia aturo ne ba alin sira na be na tuir mai futuro mai sira mos bele atau hatu buat be makan halal mesmo que mai soro buat be lá dia tapi sempre hatam buat be dia.
Durante serviço e a Coreia tinang sana luar sana saída de mak kita buat halau na ba família ou ba sociedade em Timor e luta de governo.
Ok, dia buat barang mesmo mai serviço ne durante tinang sana luar sirau atau halau buat bema mesmo que lá halau buat ia família maybe atau rasa atau conta de história tua siapa na alin sira usinentuno se bema escola de Timor. Ida harus secundária atau universidade foi na mata ya universidade foi na Liba atau gradua harus universidade secundária atau universidade harus rasik mak selo di saya agora foi na gradua ya fulang kota Liba untuk seremoni foi da kau filaba feira senaba ami halau na seremoni ya naba mesmo que ami halau buat bem simples mas buat ajuda malo tulang mal usia minha família sira bele hetanetik bersirah nesene atau amimos servis mas ke servis orang mebe siramas kozanetik ko betirak ne tabas husi hawni ajuda ma sira bele oin bele hakatono bata sensatura fotona di sensatura bele fotona ni botan ini ba
Tebot halau na umarono
iyo umar be ma kalau mebe mesmo que simples ba ina namun hal itu mebe hawni sira. Então, na fati nga nasene, coragem na fatem how sama que atu beles bola na fatem e futuro.
Obrigado pela oportunidade. Ao narrar Olívio Soares dos Santos, ao município de Algará, mas serviço ia Coreia ia 2016 do agora e experiência não tomo na minha tão cine no serviço minha minha na minha belemos por assistência para minha família.
Mais ou menos desafio saída mo kita buat hasoro durante tina hira ya Korea.
Quando va desafio ita quando mosu ia nasa ida nebe lahanesa, no mos kultura nebe lahanesa, nebe mos lahanesa, diferente teves. E a Coreia mi serviço nebe lalos mesak hanesa husi nasa Timor-Leste, mas me husi mos nasa saloro racing nema ka inclui serviço ia rai Coreia né. E agradecemos ba governo Coreia nebe halo realização dia hoitenya nasa bela por oportunidade vai ter jovem sira nos feito no mane nebe mais serviço ia Coreia. Desafio tem sempre a soro também ita a soro e a serviço nebe lahanesa e colega nebe lahanesa e depois serviço na nossa também um serviço ia companhia ida ita tem halo adaptação no belo no colega ser nebe mais possível na são sido assim exemplo si Vietnam, Camboja, Indonesia e ba Indonesia ita se bele atene neti kana sang conversa mai be atli mo husi na sam senda nebe makla ita nunca mais satu atene se media é difícil teves depois mos ia serviço pating ita hasurmos problema hane sang husi patrão sira e mo cobremos karan dia boita e salário mos karan ita hetan nebe dia mos la dia e ho paciência ho mos interesse kata kita mai tambah e objetivo ida. Então, buat sirani kita tingin ia reteniang kata buat tu kita tingin sini.
Tahu durante serviço ia Coreia ne saída de uma kita buat halo na ba família, ba sociedade de viva itinerai do Timor.
Kona ba buat nebe makalo mai labar kiu ba nasau mos ba itenia família. Exemplo, bahunya família rasi, então mo sira lavar ali uma betul bit nebe hoia depois usi oportunidade dane vamos agradecer também bele olarai halo uma bahunya anrasi mos bahunya família mos e pomos ajuda na toma usi ha betul bit nebe hoia bahunya halin sira nebe maka hansa escola e balum ketang kursus semua sira bele hetan mos benefício dane.
Ok dia, obrigado a tempo. Hau narang completo Arsenio Faglo, hau maiusi município Bogonaro, hau mais serviço a Coreia e a Tina 2016 até a data, aproximadamente Tinan hitu a Tina no ano.
Mais ou menos, ita bot minha expectativa olok mai Coreia ne saida, olok hakat ai nos Timor, at mai serviço a Coreia.
Quando vai a expectativa ser nível que ia antes a mai Coreia, em primeiro a Hanoi kata ita mai Coreia ne botou tu serviço de tecnologia de, mai dalam rumah ita nia be a serviço usa física ni tu ande, mai be depois de auto te Coreia, mai hene na realidade ita serviço ita nia isin mo bokan laos ita nia be, seda? Usa tecnologia, é uma serviço lá usa tecnologia, mas usa isin é serviço barato.
Mais ou menos desafio saída dele mas kita buat hasoro durante tina hirak ne serviço ia rai Coreia.
Quando vai desafio ser nebe que hawa hasoro an hira serviço Coreia é desafio barat. Desafio primeiro mas quando vai língua ita mai Coreia ita lah atene língua da rumah mamanda ita haru ka foti botida depois tava foti fali bacelo. Depois, ia diferente cultura moris itania ho emania. Por exemplo, hanesan ia Coreia cara kita serviço lá on time, mas be mai be o ia Timor cara kita serviço lá on time, mas be mai Coreia kita serviço tem on time. Baru siar nebe que ia Timor ita ia, mai hene hakara kala koi obrigatório ita tem que trocar caráter se nebeke lá dia kodi sai ema ida nebeke efetivo liu ato sucesso e amor esse dani. Obrigado ba.
Retantia desafio sirne, wisama ita baut ultrapassa problema ne mita soro ya raida.
Hawanuin konaba idane ita tenki ha vontade hanesa no hin colega para kuliah ita tenki ha vontade ato aprende. Labele ita hodita ni hanuin de kisala hakara kontra fali buat tidak lah dia. Se ita hare ita ni sorin hare ita no kotuk hare ita no oin. Ambiente Mauricio ne beke dia para bele lori ita paso sucesso ni ita tenki tuiri dane. Labele dia ni tanya salah sia ne beke ya Timor hawa nuin ambiente Timor konaba hanor ni ta oin saat bele Mauricio ne lagun dia. Mai be graças a Deus samai he Korea ne bele hanorin ha berbara. Por exemplo, a tem uma usa tecnologia para ver essa conhecimento sira
além de serviço ba tabot de família kawasan ba Timor ia rai coreamos imi sempre halibur hamutu ko maluk sira i mais bele relata tok ba maluk prononain sira bele hare atene mais saida mak imi halo atu unifica na fatin Timor sira ia Korea idan.
Ia rai Korea ia programa barbar teves nibe que ami participa liliu ia itenia religião católica amusira usi rai Korea amusira us Timor mai halibur ami hene cada semana am sempre tuir misa am sempre asai am agradecimento vai haman maroma mas que ami do con Timor ida segundo mak ihane ami organização de volunaran União dos Trabalhadores Timoron e Korea ida nebe que tamatam bami kare kiha colega balu makhetam problema união idane se toma responsabilidade máximo de ajuda ami por exemplo hanesan kare colega balu hetam moras união se organiza colega maru Timoruan ser nebe que Korea hodi futuro ba itene colega nebe hetam moras e cada tinamos união halon ninia programa ida ita bolu na programa ka atividade ida nebe que união fonaram festas amigos iha neba Timoruan hotu nebe iha rai Korea laran tomak sira sempre hasor malu fatinida depois sira bele expressa sirnia sentimento contente sentimento triste han hamutuk iha mos atividade no game sira nebe que sira halo henba nebe how representa malu Timoruan sira ne hotu agradece teves ba organização ne tamba bele maski ita mayusi raido mai be ita mai te rai Korea união idane sempre haliburita hodi sai Timoruan ne beke making.
Perguntas ikus ita buat servisi ha rai Korea tinan lugu kidaona osan sirne ita buat hetanne halo ona saida ba familia o ka investe ona membuat rumah ita buat dia carreira no trabalhador ya rai Korea.
How namin perguntas rin soket teve saw tamba antes sa may Korea ne se how bele kuliah how honesto how mai su família de nebe que ema bele dihan Moris ia mukita rumah han bele han ita how no laus how mesak masente dane mabe colega barak masente dane tamane buat nebe que motiva teve saune oin sa how para bele muda haunia família ida oin han at ne bele bafan dia idane haunia prinsip primeiro nebe que how lori mai Korea antes how tumai em segundo ami helai he umai nebe que ita bele dihan se how bele kuliah nisto ita bele dihan how consegue muda umai dene how bele hari fali umai de dia bahani familia e hamos for escola bahani alin sira e haunia alin ida nemak sai hanesan ema nebe graduação primeiro e hamni família nebe how agradece teves ba oportunidade dane e depois usi dane hanesan moin hakuliah ita mai Korea ne ita tinggi hatene usa moris babai colega barak yang hatene usa moris e dalam rumah haudian kayaknya hau memang hatene usa moris juni kare hau mai hau aproveita mania tecnologia sira hene hau aprende depois hau sai hau conhecimento sira ligiu iha ia setor educação ninya também ita labele hanu indihan buat tidak aprende ne laos dia ita badet aula meta aprende era ida agora ne ita bele usa teknologi ne atau aprende de fali hai bunga ia fali uma larang quarto larang bele lebe usi buat cerne hotu hakoko hasai hang skill hakoko hasai hang mentalidade e how iha be mentalidade ja se how bele halo de uma nusa halo bele halo buat tidak nebeke bele for moris bahau e bele for moris bahau zera sausira por exemplo haunya oang ba fal haunya oang depois anesa ne antau hau motiva haunya anto hau tinggi asai osan ser nebeke hau heta de ore usi hau salari ou isso para hau fal investimento sira e graças a Deus buat sira nebeke hau plano maromak tulung tebe sau hau consegue halo investimento ia setor tolu ga hatira nebe que hau halo mana mas que asuro problema barbara nebe a mentalidade dia que nebe que hau ia nunca hamate haunia vontade ou insa atu beli sucesso ni e hakara kala koi hau tenki halo remata babuat ni hau tenki halo remata babuat ni bema kau hawana lili hon investimento sih obrigado bar
mas o investimento ita bota em termine saída de a área hat tolu
investimento primeiro nebe macau halo ia setor pecuária ia agricultura ia setor pecuária nebe fokus ia produção na mano e investimento ne halo ia 2019 non ia se lau hela musu problema barbara mas be hau na fati buka dalam ou isa para ultrapassa problema sirane ho solução efetivo ser nebe que hau se foba problema ser nebe que hau asuri ang negócio assim e negócio segundo yang hauloke a minimarket e depois minimarket ne lalau hanesan saída mak hau hakara tamo problema barbara problema recurso humano depois minimarket ne takaona nia la hahuan operação agora e hau lá como sambar teve esse negócio ne mas be hau na fatin hanesan na kuliah hau na fatin dia vontade de hakara avança mas que hau lakon mas be bahau buat tidak be oportunidade hanesan ne karik ita lakon labele hanuin dia ita ne dia final na baitenia prosesu sira ita tengi usa ida lakon ne para amenda tan ita na mentalidade ou isa para ita bele sai dia lutan tanpa buat tidak bisnis ne kan ni bele hasuru problema barbara hanesan ne daruma husi problema ne bo hasuru ne ni hanesan fo hanuin da bao o kata ki hane o sala tambane o hetan problema agora ita tinggi buka solução rumah para bele resolver itu problema ne o sida sucesso ne hitem oin
ida nema a minha experiência moris no trabalhador e remunerai pode buka moris para itenia família no itenia nação obrigado
obrigado pela oportunidade e Raoni Narang Inácio Soares, hago se município Aileu, no hago serviço ihane, hago hosi ano 2018, mas to momento ne.
Saída mo que desafio bot deve liu, ita bot asoro by hira, ita bot serviço no hela e Australia, no insa ita bot asoro irane.
Dia, bahau desafio primeiro no nebema bot debes maka kita kuliah kona bakaransi ka rate osang ne rate ita hau serviço hene ita bele hetan osan dolar Australia ita bele hetan osan bara nebe vai hira ne rate internacional quando tu ita lore ba Timor osan bele bot nebe ita ba tropa Timor ne sai osan ki ida ne desafio primeiro no segundo hanesan cultura nebe que ita hatene kata Australia ne multicultural ema oioi nebe ita hasoro ema o karakter la hanesan ema ne maneira kaida ne mas la hanesan agora o sama atu bele recupera o desafio serane primeiro liga a cultura ita pouco atu simo integra itani an e a situação ho ema ne bede ita pouco aprende o sira no aceita kata ema ida con a cultura cada nação unida con a cultura ema ne ida con el carácter entre si a o si b ne carácter la hanesa ita pouco aprende o sira hafoin maka ita bela serviço mutuo desafio con aba osang ne red mensa atu bele sa bele recupera ka hosa nere ita tenge hatene se ita check mak osa nere tu ni tala semana ba Timor ita koko la ruma ita ne família precisa debes mas precisamos ter que compreender que se osa nere tu un liu ita manda $7 se for 5%, então dia cliu se bele koko homore selo mas be ita hapara la wetuan hori hento osa nere bele sai.
Ya dalam saída mas kita buat ya experiência ya Austrália ajuda ona kita buat atau apoio kita buat ya família no comunidade ya Timor-Leste.
Kuliah kena benefício karek. Sim. Se kuliah kena benefício, bahau bel serviço e Austrália né benefício bom debes bahau na família se compara ao serviço de Timor-Leste. Tambah bahau liga kena experiência e Timor-Leste enziou mas ao serviço ona instituição governo mas ao serviço ona maybe se de serviço de Timor-Leste ita serviço enziou internacional será de belerian kata kita não sandia maybe se ita serviço ao instituição governo sira liga ela balei dan memang kita standar salário mínimo serviço Timor-Leste a gente asan compara entre serviço Austrália e Timor-Leste bahau serviço Austrália benefício bom deles. Por exemplo, ita mais sene início ita lá uma nebedia ita lá beli careta mas ita mais serviço e categoria nebe ema valo chap ita kata ita ne mais saya tambah ema kan ou ita serviço por casa mas be ita ne mores beli dia que fale ema nebe mas serviço hanya sene.
Durante mana ne serviço ihane mana halona saída ba família nomos ba ia comunidade ya mana sirne pai hawati
ya bahau buat nebe mak durante ne hau hala ona hau lebel sura kata hau halo dane halo dan ba ai be hau apoio hau ne família hau ne bingalin serane wana be sekolah hau serane semester kasi dan necessidade hau universidades hau apoio dane depois mos apoio ba aminia ana sa hatene kata kitu Timor ne ita 97-98% católico. Então, hau apoiamos para que vá a minha atividade de igreja. E para o pessoal, sa atudian halo batruma na dia que lá ya, pelo menos se hane transporte vale reunião.
Kita biar dari hangar melos kami masih kadal bagai bolu ada itu sekarang Charlie e house município original Baucau subdistrito Baucau how mai e Austrália e 2019 até agora dão ao state Queensland Tasmania agora dão ao muda fila para mai state Queensland parte Bandaberg ini.
Ada few saída mas kita bot hasuru e Austrália no inside tabot bele ultrapassa desafios né ia mengira serviço Austrália.
Colher com nova desafios neve que usualmente hawa sur ia treino primeira nasara quando o serviço primeiro para nasar lima hawa sur dari sang neve que ita tem que hadir cedo de 3 ou 4 horas a madrugada depois 5 horas peguei hona todos para noite bel serviço e no ita koko bebek ikus mai habitua romana no ita nasara e desafio segundo neve que através mata língua e dalam rumah ia treino ketika sore ema barat e ilu ene da Timor Leste me serviço ne mai malai mo sirne ia australiano sira ema nação serviço ne Tonga Fiji Samoa no nação serviço nebe Pacifica Island sira serviço ne tem que adaptar o tene língua mesmo ita língua nebe que lá no nasar mai be ita pouco para atu soro sira o tene maneira nebe que ita ia ita bela soro.
Ia dalam saída mas kita bot nya experiência e Austrália pode ajuda família sira no comunidade ia Timor.
Dalam nebe que experiência nebe que how ultrapassa atau ajuda família hira how mais serviço e Austrália né pelo menos ne bele mangano how nia nah buat nebe que how ia ordinarnya habila ajuda família sira ia Timor família Timor ou bele haruka sira ou faini te kosam basira ou nete buat rumah nebe que durante nite la ia te bele facilita na buat rumah nebe que ia halo uma buat sira ne ola transporte durante el transporte te bele facilita ola transporte para habara que tiene ahí plazo de halo rico mai be irene para ola parte e tiene necessidade básica ida ebe ita cara uma série completa e tiene viagem ia moris ne e asara minha vantagem serviço ita bele mak primeiro ita hetang osang, segundo ita aprende experiência buat barat, terceiro ita ia confiança para usi empregador sira uhira ita tutu dia ita serviço dia ema usa na fate ita e ori buat sira ne maka ita bele ajuda filfale família comunidade ajuda desenvolver os itinerários.
Ya, kami narang completo Lucas Evangelista de Jesus Salsinia, fosse município Armeira, agora round mai ia Australia badala 5.
Saída maka desafio itu bot liu nebe ita bot asoro bahira ita bot serviço no hela ia Australia no oinsa ita bot bele asoro irane.
Dia buat nebema durante neo hasoro ia Australia o desafio nebema hasoro mas primeiro hanesan Timor dalam rumah ita hadir tardi mas mengira ita mayon Australia akar kelakoi ita hadir awalan o significa kata kita tinggal hadir se tambah menetos ita tinggal taman aku pun sebelum lor matan sai emani sertos servisu hutan kona ba seluk mak environmental tambah ita ihana bane buat nebema sempre comunidade sempre colheva malu sempre será recebe malu mas e Australia ita ba serviço batos também fati ba será ba akomodasi mai tos ba akomodasi mai tos é maselo para colher ita so ita rit no bela e mos kona ba será desafio será mak kita suruh ne ia terreno mak dalam rumah kita hetan teguran usi tani supervisor usi tani será usi tani manager o tani tosnai kona ba tani dalam rumah tani koordinasi será mus kita hetan teguran o desafio será ne ita suruh mus atu será sumariza buat nabe mak kita tu será tatu hasuru buat serne importante makan kita tinggal pasensia hasuru buat serne aprende buat serne pergunta segundo mak konaba benefício saída mak ami trabalhador nessa Austrália heta sim benefício ne buat tetes primeiro mak seda suporta família suporta família, arukali serba sekolah, rumah dulu kita lah humores simples, tapi agora vamos kita hepan na osang perempuan, kita berharap nanti rumah ba família, ba basira nebe mak ihawan harukona wan serba sekolah yang anesan international school, atau ne serba le hepan dia kelitan edukasi rumah dia, ini memang benefisi dia. Benefício ida mak dulu kita lahetan ia seda kita la loke bisnis rumah mai be wenir kita to ia Australia ita fila ba ita loke ni kita ni bisnis rumah ni be support tambah osan be mak ita hetan Australia saya ita la hala batida mak badne badi agora ita mak ting ser manager per atune osan bane be osan atu hausaida ita mak ting ser
dia Obrigada a tempo, Raunenara Francisca Antônia, pusi município de Queque, e hau começa serviço na Austrália e a fim do ano 2020.
Saída mak desafio bot liu, nebe ita bot hasoro, panghira ita bot serviço no hela e Austrália, no insa ita bot hasoro idane.
Primeiro desafio nebe hau hasoro, mak panghira iha assunto familiar yang lebih importante, how la bele fila para participa no desafio selo mas mengira serviço e senti colemos ita tem que obriga e hakasa ba tama serviço hani sampai bye e depois asa ya cuaca nebe sa udang ou angin botmos na fating ba serviço tamba fazer vai ter horário nebe que sai ona e ita mai si Timor ba ita atu hadiah família ne moris tamane ma cara golai te tem que hasoro situação serasa
ya dalam saida mak ita botnya experiência em Austrália ajuda ona ita bot atau apoio ita botnya família na comunidade e TIMORESE serviço ne ba ni desafio mak saida mak kita halo atau hakat de desafio sirani
dia obrigada ba pergunta segundo con income nebe hau heta usi serviço Austrália niang hau bele ajuda na hani família sira banhira sira precisa osang e a situação nebe urgente hau bele halo transferência ba ira Timor para sira bele usa e depois usi osang nimos hau bele asa ajuda então quando a necessidade de família niang nebe precisa. Obrigada.
Hau narang sekitar 200 Sanses, hau hosti município de Xa, hau mai iha Austrália, hau iha 2020, no hau mai hanesang trabalhador seasonal worker, hau mai keras iha Tasmania, no agora hau hanesang trabalhador PLS.
Saída maka desafio bot liu na de ita bot hasoro walhira ita bot serviço no vela e Austrália no insa ita bot hasoro ida ne
hadiak mai hau primeiro estar atau dehang desafio bot nebe mak hasoro primeiro e Austrália walhira mai hene mak anesang soke cultura ou culture shock tamba cultura ne la hanesang ko itaniang diferente no hanesang mos environmento nebe phone banhira ita mai phone ita sente hanesang chamas ou larantarido de vez em quando mos ita tau no triste liu mak ita doko sita nia família no turmai haus ita mos katak kelima mos saimos obstáculo ida tamba ita hatene kata kiha Timor ita ni klima tropical mai de repente o mai hastor cres klima ida nebe maliring nomos laos maliring date mai be to tempo vinter salju mos iha no ikus liu hamos sita hutu katak alimentação mos saimos obstáculo ida ka desafio ida tamba hahang nebe makita hahang iha Timor ita mai hene buka aras kapeles ne asita mos kata alimentação saimos desafio bot ida biha
ia dalam saída makita bot ni experiência iha Austrália ajudona ita bot atu apoia ita bot ni família no comunidade ida TIMORESE
hadiak dalam nebe mak ajuda ka apoio hane família primeiro mak finansial ne den kata direita hau haru ka basira lori tulun sira fo apoio sira iha qualquer saída mak sira precisa inamos hau bele construir mahon rumah basira nomos hanesang sosamos transporte wan rumah ino segundo mak hau to dehan kata ba comunidade nela os hau fo direita basira mai be hau bele kata indireita abele kata liu hosi badai ka construção hau fo sira ha serviço sira serviço ne kata hau ajuda ona sira li hosi vencimento ne be mak hau iha no hau bele selu sira no dia kata desafio saída mak hau serviço né na sahetang em Austrália.
Sim.
Desafio né mak hanesang tuang hira ita ba serviço ita tem que hasoro tanto udang tanto maliri maybe ita na fati tem que ba serviço e depois hanesang ita tem que hadir cedo ita nemos how senti desafio hotu atau maliring mas o tem que hadir cedo para o tem que ba ita la ver acesso si idane how senti hanesan desafio ida vai vir ita halau serviço da Austrália.
Dia ko obrigado barak pa atenção, balon tur toma tandukur, balon to baro. Mas bem idane ma kita nem maluk siran ini história. No ohinda desa intarona konaba prinsípio, motivação, intarona konaba saran ini palestra nebe kuliah konaba desafio balon nebe sira pesquisa hetang. I ohin intarona rasik mas bait nem maluk sir nebe serviço neba. Beledean desafio botli nebe sira hasoro, idama cultura clima nebe lahane sama itan nyarai, depois disiplina nebe karek lahane sama so itan yang, ita hene ita barok temu itu amba serviço, ema neba dan tinggi puntual buat cerne, ida neba kaunai desafio lubuk ida hahang nebe sira soru, i buat diak balong nebe sira serviço nebe sira konsegalo ma barak halona uma, balong halo serne investimento, i barak makselu serne alin sira, serne familia sira nine sekolah, no bela ajuda sira sahi situação nebe mukit, bahia situação nebe diak liutang. Ano ina nema kondisão real nebe itarona kari kimia pergunta em label husu mai hau tam hau mos label hatang isira be hatane ya Korea kare hau bel raide ano to ene maksesaung ida nenyang i tuir mai hau entrega fali ba bepi mos la kontiana ada bepi la kontamba ni hau ne kolega sekolah SMP ho SMA. Hotiana super valen bem.
Dia kita bahasa lima dari tambah amu João Acosta Bovida. Tuiri ita nini horário ita sei retamos le forma taca ninien, o se encerramento ba loron da huluk ninien. Então convido que esse magnífico reitor da Universidade Nacional Timor-Leste, Dr. João Martins, a levanta a roditaca. A fim de nenhum tecíamos oração, amo João, a tu bele dirigir-lhe em oração.
Bom, obrigado pela oportunidade. Sei a força que é. Sei bom dia que teve, né? Bom, a respeito da amo provincial Dom Bosco Niang, amo reitor Instituto Superior Dom Bosco, amo Acácio presidente do Conselho Geral do Díli, amo Sirhoto Yané, nós participantes Sira, Manasara, good afternoon. Nós além estudantes ser nevema que hoje marca presença desde que o ainda der, mas estou agora. Para ser nevema que lá consegue acompanhar to ainda like lá combo tira também e buat fura que mais iku ser lá consegue assistir. Não é triste, espero que até abang se lá bela nessa né. Mas no entanto se palestrante na intolo, se amo Bastiano si Flores a museu, nós se mana Sarah Niner, nós terá uma experiência viva, se também
trabalhador sira na mesma que a Coreia e a Austrália, oportunidade que dia que teve loca e também neon e também horizonte quando vai migration worker que labor migration e tare aussi ponto de vista filosófica nian, haremos aussi ética nian e mos dignidade nessas questões de mesma que hoje e também manasara hato e a condição situação em Austrália de mesma que da ruma manai o sambot, mas bem a situação morre, a situação de mesma que precário teve e ao fiar que tá malu seria corremos através da situação, nessa se expõe e a ser nem conversa hoje. E a esperança que tá será atingido mesmo que o sacrifício é ele mas será halo. Desafio bote mesmo que será atravessa e será consegue halo mudança tanto vai ser nem andrasik, mas que a disciplina hoje não sabe ele hader cedo, hoje não sabe ele cumprir serviço que tuir horário de mesma que marcada, né dia que teve. A única mesma que ita tem que aprender. Estamos sendo que ia Timor quando é mat halo construção, talvez a buca de trabalhador Timor seria é malakoi. Ita sempre buca é mais usizawa ou no mínimo é mais se kefa ser mais barak mais serviço halo uma que halo sanser né também ita ia Timor ita malu trabalhador seria lia mata lia moris barak teve. Dalam rumah almoço tu fumar de cigarro mas lori horas ini mak fumar cigarro ne hotu. Ira nema que ita tem que hadiah. Saya tak karak Timor bawoi ita nia disiplina work ethics ita tem que hadiah. Atune ita bele contribuir a moris tuir organizado e programado. Jadi ita serviço tuir horas, label serviço la tuir ver my time. Ira nema ita problema ita Timor we work in according to our time. Ita lá tuir horas de trabalho mesmo que normalmente labor será define. Desafio bote de baita mesmo que ita 25 anos independência, 23 anos formal, 26 anos depois do referendo mas estou agora. Mas o desafio não é que ita sei a sorro ela desde que essa geração será o que mais estou além será espera que ita tenha one será a minha one ou be one será se lá bele continua maior perspectiva de fome, não mais horizonte de fome, a tunune ita bele desenvolve Timor ne bele saída aquele tanque. Deve agradecer temos a cooperação entre Instituto Superior Dom Bosco ou o Entali, a conferência né, que seminário né, que fura que temos. Além de ita culia com a questões live migration e vamos acrescentar que importante a universidade seria Timor tem que serviço a muito a nessa dago ita halo né a turne irida que labele halo também tem halo irida que da România impacto lá do bot e agora por aqui te fura que teve também estudantes de UNTL e estudantes de Dom Bosco não mostra selo tá espero para hoje espírito né ita tem que cultiva ita tem que cura a turne ita bele ia share understanding ba situação desafio saída mas que a nação através. A nós devemos haver hato agradecer a comissão organizadora, a Macácio, diretor-geral, a doutor Jacinto, devemos que serviço Macácio teves, nós a reitor, sempre a coordenar, a Mugil, a Mugui, a Mugil agora sempre o encontro através de Zoom, mas hoje mas vem a soro, ternyata a Mugil Tio América ni uang, apa punya Tio América clear tu nama Amia Saudi, parabéns para mos Tio América, bela ya uang da padre, desculpa, orgulho mas para família outro. Então ele nem bilato, espera ama itu bel mais vir fali na conia fatene. Obrigado bem.
Obrigado ainda Reta, magnífico reitor, Dr. João Martins. Para nem convida então o Dr. Américo, boa oração, você vai ser dirigido Padre João.
BPD Américo oração, você amuzão, ne fila kotuk ne dia haunia kolega. O hinda dari Padre Casimiro Reza português, agora hau reza fali ha Tetum. Tahun ini sekolah Portugal, hau sekolah Timor det. O de Padre, o de Filho, o de Espírito Santo siranaran. Aman lalehan, ami mai tabot nia oi, iha lorong dane nia rohan. Agradece ba presente Moris, ba presente encontro niang, no matenek nebe fahai iha seminário internacional dane, kona ba migração. Naing itabot rase kuluk migrante ida, banghira Sagrada Família halai barai Egipto. Itabot hatene luta sira husik nebe husik sernia rai, o dibuka segurança, dignidade, no esperança. Oi intarona, reflete no fai história sira nebe fohanoi maita, kona ba sagrado, husi ema ide ninia viagem. Ame agradece ba itabot, balian ser nebe amirona, ba conhecimento nebe ami fahe, no ba solidariedade nebe ami hahuhari. Harek bensa uma participante, orador sira, no organizador sira hotu, atau sorumutu idane bele continua sai fonte na romaniang, compaixão niang, no justiça niang, ba ami ne mang aling migrante sira. Nudarami conclui loron dahulu kidane, ami husubai tabot, nai, atau hafung ami ni hanoi no fuang. Po descansa mai ami hekalang ne, atau abang ami bele filafali ho hafung no naklo ke liutang bai tabot ni espiritu ni inspiração sira. Atau Maria, inan dobeng no migrante sira ni inang, guia ita, honia cuidado inang niang, no São José viajante ni protetor sira, viajante sira ni protetor, tau mata mba ita, banghira ita continua viagem irane hamutuk. Podi amena in Jesus Cristo itawan, be maroma ko ita, hamutuk iha Espiritu Santo. Maroma kori ko imi. Maroma ko ito maknai harek ben samba imi, amang oang no Espiritu Santo.
Senhoras e senhores, além estudantes seritania samba lono dahulu ni ramato na maita basa lima ba itanias seminário internacional né em kata kita hotu bele heta informação barak no obrigado por sua participação ativa e tá sor falmalo aban tukusia. Adeus.
Yak hakara kavizu bai kolega estudante sira karek saya bele lori ho lisu nebe makita uza tamba amanhã ita se usa falfating. Obrigado.